right, I think we should start, and I request Kirtana to go for an introduction, and then Elaine would have a talk. Yeah, thank you again, all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cogtalk. Cogtalk is an interdisciplinary forum for mind and brain sciences, which is organized by Center for Neural and Cognitive Sciences, University of Hyderabad. Today's invited speaker is Professor Ellen Bialystok from York University, Toronto, Canada. Welcome, ma'am, and thank you for accepting our invite. And I am Kirtana Kapile, a final year PhD student at CNCS University of Hyderabad. Let me take this opportunity to introduce Professor Ellen Bialystok. She's a distinguished research professor of psychology and Walter Gordon Research Chair of Lifespan Cognitive Development at York University, and also an associate scientist at Rotman Research Institute of Baycrest Center for Geriatric Care. She is an officer of the Order of Canada and also a fellow of Royal Society of Canada. Her research work on bilingualism and cognition spans over decades and has brought in significant insights into these mechanisms. Her key findings include the identification of individual differences among bilingual children on cognitive and language abilities. The important aspect is also the discovery of the use of different brain networks by monolingual and bilingual young adults while performing a simple conflict task. One of the most interesting findings based on her bilingual research is that of the delayed onset of dementia in bilingual older adults. And recent work of hers is kind of stepping ahead to explore consequences of multilingualism in children. She has won many accolades based on her research and merit, and was awarded by the Canadian Society for Brain, Behavior and Cognitive Science Heb Award in 2011, and Killam Prize for Social Sciences in 2010. And these are just among many of the awards that she has got. And we are very glad to have you, ma'am, and also it is a great pleasure to interact with you today. And also I would like to welcome Professor Ramesh Mishra, Chair at Center for Neural and Cognitive Science, University of Hyderabad, and he's chairing this session today.
Welcome.
He mainly works on bilingualism, control, attention, awareness. His recent book titled Bilingualism and Cognitive Control deals with cognitive consequences of bilingualism from an evolutionary, neuroscientific, psychological perspective, along with other controversial topics in the area of research, bilingual research. Thank you both for joining us. And before we start the session, I would request everyone to keep their mics off and only switch it on when they wish to speak during the Q&A session. During the Q&A session, I request you to introduce yourself before asking the question. All right? First, Professor Mishra is going to share a few words, followed by Professor Bialystok's talk. Now, I would like to invite Professor Mishra to share a few words.
I welcome everyone, and many people that I know and I do not know have joined, and I would say it's a very historic occasion for all of us that we have Ellen today speaking to us on a topic of our interest. And I would like to say a couple of words about the University of Hyderabad. It's and the center that I have been chairing for a while, and where a lot of my research activity has been happening. University of Hyderabad is a research university ranked very highly in India, and is one of the top tier institute of eminences now declared by Government of India. And the focus remains on doing cutting edge research in diversified fields. The Center for Neural Cognitive Science that has been investing by me is a new center about a decade ago, and we have both neuroscience and cognitive science research. And it is India's second such center placed in a university context, although we have many centers now in other technical universities. About Ellen, I would say that at least in the domain of cognitive advantage, all the research that I started following when I started is either in agreement with Ellen or in opposition to Ellen. So there is no there is no neutrality with, I have not noticed. And I have at times gone this way, that way, depending on the mood and the theme or other people. So we are very happy to have you here on a topic of vital importance. We were just chatting before all of you joined that it's such of vital importance both to India and to Canada and to many pockets in the world, the study of language, bilingualism in action, and what does it do to your mind and brain and to your entire cognition. And Elaine's work spans almost all aspects of it. And it has changed its contour and tone over a period of time, which I have been following. And nevertheless, we have a very significant scholar that many of you know. I don't want to introduce her further. So with these words, I would request Elaine to go ahead and give a talk. Thank you, everyone, for joining again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ramesh. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for the nice introduction. I'm very glad to be able to talk to you on Zoom. I'd be happier if I could be there with you and actually give this talk in person, but these unusual times and the magic of Zoom is probably what makes this possible.
As soon as the world opens up, I am going to do that.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so I need to share my screen. Has this been enabled? Okay, good. So thank you. And what I'm going to do, what I decided to talk to you about, is to take the big picture of this question, which, as Ramesh hinted, has now become somewhat controversial, and give you my view on what's actually going on. The big context in which this bilingualism research is played out is neuroplasticity, the idea that experience has the capacity to change mind and brain. It's well known, and I must say, well accepted, that many experiences have this effect, and I've given pictures of some of them. I'm not going to discuss them. But there's no controversy that engagement in some of these activities leaves an indelible trace on mind and brain. So the big story about bilingualism is that it's another one of those neuroplastic inducing experiences. Well, why? What is it about this particular language experience that would have such profound effects? There is at this point no controversy by anyone, no matter what their views on cognitive consequences of bilingualism, that for bilinguals there is joint activation of languages. And that's important because it means there is a constant need for selection. So in this highly technical linguistic drawing of language representations in the brain, you can see that if two languages are constantly active, there's going to be a problem of selection. We know that bilinguals do not make massive intrusion errors, they don't make mistakes, they don't find themselves in moments of confused paralysis because they can't select the right language. So how do they do it? They do it through domain general processes of attention, and for that reason, those attention networks, those attention processes are impacted, and therein lies the plasticity. So the plasticity that follows from bilingualism is not on a language representation, it's not on a linguistic process, it's on domain general attention processes. And so the outcome is that bilingualism leads to an adaptation in attention systems. So that's my whole talk. And I'm going to try to illustrate it through various arguments and evidence. This is a kind of a map of the research on bilingualism and its cognitive and brain consequences. And all I've done is lay out that this research takes place across the lifespan. It uses behavioral and imaging approaches, And within each of these cells, there's all sorts of studies that are done, some of them more numerous or more diverse than others, but that's the basic lay of the land. That's where the evidence comes from, all of it. However, this controversy that I think everyone is now aware of focuses on that. Behavioral evidence from young adults performing executive function conflict tasks. That's the target. Now let's look at how that came to happen. We published a paper early on in this research where we looked at monolinguals and bilinguals at different ages, at different age snapshots across the lifespan, performing one of these simple tasks. The task we chose was the Simon task. You press a button indicating the color of the stimulus square, ignoring the position, thereby creating congruent trials where the stimulus is on the same side as the correct response key, and incongruent trials where the stimulus is on the opposite side, forcing you to overcome this very rapid and almost unconscious pull towards the position of the stimulus. So that's the Simon task. And we used this as one of our very first attempts to see how precise these cognitive differences between monolinguals and bilinguals were. We published this in 2005, 15 years ago, and it was really in very early days of this kind of research. So we gave this task to children. Now the red lines are monolinguals, the blue lines are bilinguals. That is the color scheme for the whole talk, so you don't have to worry about squinting to read the legends. So these are reaction times. So monolinguals are slower than bilinguals, and they're slower for both the congruent and incongruent trials. These are middle-aged adults. Monolinguals are slower than bilinguals. These are older adults. Everybody slows down. There's a big congruency effect. But again, the monolinguals are slower than the bilinguals. And the young adults, not a trace of difference. They are exactly the same. And not only are they exactly the same, but they're really fast. The average time is something like 500 milliseconds no matter what you do. It's tough to get that mean, that group mean down. So what we concluded in this paper 15 years ago was that bilinguals were performing better in 3 of the age groups with no difference in young adults. And this has been replicated many times, and now there's like 6 meta-analyses a week showing the same thing, which is not surprising because they're all based on the same data. But that rant is for another day. Now this finding actually, and this consistent replication of this no difference for young adults gained attention when it was published by Papp and Greenberg in their 2013 paper. And I think it gained attention because, I mean, this had been going on for some time and nobody really cared much. But Papp and Greenberg shone a big spotlight on it and said, we did this experiment exactly the way Bialystok did. There were no differences between groups. We did it in 3 studies and it was always the same. Therefore, all of the research showing that bilinguals do these tasks better is wrong. That was their conclusion. And so I want you to look at their data, because I went back to their actual raw data. Here is, they say we can't replicate those studies. Here is their data. Okay, so watch. This is what we reported for young adults, and that's what they reported. That's what we reported. That's what they reported. It is, in fact, a perfect replication. So we know this. We know for sure if you give these simple executive function tasks to young adults and you only measure reaction time or accuracy, everybody's going to look the same. So what does that mean? How can we interpret these data? So I have to go back now and take a moment to look at the framework that has been the primary interpretation for this research and the primary motivation for designing the studies. We used it too at first because this is what made most sense at the time. The research moves forward from the assumption that bilingualism is doing something to enhance executive functioning or executive control. So you have to say, all right, so what is executive functioning? And in, the late 90s and early 2000s, when you looked around to see what it was, there wasn't a lot. It was controlled processing, it had these features, but there wasn't a lot to go on until Miyake published the Unity and Diversity model. This was a clear and organized attempt to explain exactly what executive functioning means. So let's look at it. He argued that executive functioning consists of three independent, although overlapping, subcomponents that he called updating, shifting, and inhibition. Each of them was associated with a specific set of executive function tasks, and indeed, the model was derived from a confirmatory factor analysis using performance on these tasks. And these are the various loadings. So this is the essence of the model. You take all of these tasks, you throw them into a hopper, they sort themselves into these three subcomponents, and that is the structure of the executive function, hugely influential. The argument, the logic, and I have to stress this is the logic, just accept this is true, the inevitable logic is this. You take one of the tasks, for example, the Stroop, and you get, and I'm using this very awkward phrase, better bilingual performance, because you cannot talk about something as vague and all-inclusive as the bilingual advantage. That becomes like the dodo bird. Does it exist or not? I have to look behind the tree. What we're talking about is empirical evidence in which bilinguals perform better. So better bilingual performance. So let's say one of these tasks, like the Stroop, reveals better performance by bilinguals. According to the logic of the model, we see that Stroop indexes inhibition. And therefore, again, according to the logic of the model, we can say that bilinguals have better inhibition. And if that's the case, the model says, therefore they should show this inhibition advantage on all tasks that we deem to be measures of inhibition. Except they don't. And this has been so difficult, so intractable, because the predictions from that model just never work out. The integrity of the components is not supported. We get an absence of what should be supported. For example, there should be correlations across the tasks. There is not. There should be, if it's inhibition, these effects should only be found for incongruent trials because that's where inhibition is needed and not congruent trials. That is not the case. These whole assignments in terms of what is inhibition are completely falsifiable. Things are classed as inhibition that in fact have been shown through very careful research to tap very disparate processes. And an important distinction here was made by Sylvia Bungay in 20 years ago between inhibition of response, don't press the button, and response suppression, don't get distracted by that flashing light. Bilinguals and monolinguals are equivalent on the first. They're not equivalent on the second. They're just all called inhibition here. And as I mentioned already, at least half and maybe more of the studies, especially with young adults, following this logic show no effect. So it's a complete mess, because if we accept this model of executive function and then logically work through what it predicts, almost none of those predictions are found. What can we say? Well, either we can conclude the model is right, the predictions are right. It just turns out there's no difference between monolinguals and bilinguals, because those predictions follow the logic of the model. Or the model is wrong, so the predictions are wrong. So if the predictions came from a set of false assumptions, those aren't in fact the outcomes we should be expecting. So let's revisit that model. So there it is again. And most of the arguments that I've made are aimed at this level of these three sub-processes, these three components. So let's get rid of them and go back to the tasks that Miyake began with. I mean, they're a reasonable selection of tasks that in one way or another index executive functioning. And if you look at the tasks and you look at them carefully and you say, what is it about this that requires controlled processing? What is it about this that makes it a more frontal task rather than a more medial task? What is it? How did these tasks get there if we've taken away the level of those sub-processes? And what you'll see very clearly is that all of these tasks require attention in some way. Now, attention is vague, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So they're all tasks that require focused attention, maintenance of attention, selective attention in different ways. So maybe the effect of bilingualism is in processes that modulate attention. Is there any evidence? So I'm going to now go through a set of studies that in one way or another take attention as the primary construct and look at what we can say about language group differences in performance. And we start with infancy. I think that some of the most incredible and most interesting, and I think ultimately it will be the most formative research being done in bilingualism now, is being done with infants. And this is really important because all of our assumptions so far have been that the reason that bilingualism might modify anything at all is because people are using languages and have to select a word. Infants don't speak. They don't say anything. So here we're really getting into a pure state of going into an environmental influence on developing systems. So infant attention is really fundamental, and it's the key to much cognitive development. This is clear, and researchers in infant and child development acknowledge the special place of attention, the development of attention. So you take an infant and you stick the infant in an environment where they are exposed to either a single linguistic system or two, sometimes more linguistic systems. And even though the infant isn't speaking, we know they're absorbing a lot from their environment, and the multilingual environment is more complex. That is clear. And it's more complex because we know they can distinguish between the languages. If it was all just babbled to them, then it wouldn't matter how many language systems were involved, but we know for sure they are distinguishing between the languages, because of really outstanding research that I don't have the time to tell you about, but I will refer you to work by Janet Worker and her colleagues where they look at 6, 7, and 8-month-old infants in monolingual versus bilingual environments, and they can tell exactly what language is going on. So the issue then is if they can distinguish between the languages in their environment, are there traces of this distinction in their nonverbal attention to non-linguistic stimuli? So I will tell you very briefly about a study we did with 6-month-old infants that were being raised in monolingual or bilingual homes. Infants were put in this very pleasant environment. They were happy there. They're in this sort of crib thing. They look up. It's a dark room. There's a display here that we use to project the experimental stimuli, and there's an LED eye tracker that looks down on them. So here's the task, very simple. They see a stimulus that is a cue. It's either a checkerboard or a target, and the checkerboard or target indicates that any second now, this incredible dancing star, which they think is amazing, is going to appear, and it'll appear either on the left or the right. And through this association, they can learn that if it's a checkerboard, it'll be on the left, and so on. And they're so excited about seeing this silly dancing star, they begin to anticipate and look to the location before it even appears. So the first question is, can they even learn this? They're 6 months old. Can they even learn this? And they can. So these again are monolingual and bilingual infants. And these are the percentage of times they anticipate where the star is going to be. The dotted line is chance, and they're all well above chance, and they're equal. So they can all learn it, which I find amazing. And this is how long it takes them to make their anticipatory saccade to the correct side. They're identical. So then we say, okay, got you little infants, we're going to do something totally nasty. And in the next batch of trials, we don't explain this to the infant, we switch the association. So the cue indicates the opposite side. Can they learn this? Can they override what they just learned and been rewarded for, and now begin to look in the opposite position? Again, that's chance, and the answer is only the bilinguals exceed chance. How long does it take them? Well, the bilinguals are just as fast as they were before. The monolinguals are slow, and they're slow because they're confused. Because something is wrong, I don't know where to find the star, and so it takes them a long time to figure out where to look. So even at 6 months old, we're seeing evidence that these attentional systems are working better for the infants in bilingual environments. I'm going to skip this one because I think I'm going to run out of time. I like that study, but I'm going to skip it. Ask about it in the Q&A if you want. I want to talk about this one. There's a lot of these studies out there that look simply at reaction time evidence from young adults, and they say, yeah, but the groups were the same. Monolinguals are the same as bilinguals. And the way they do it is they take the mean reaction time and they compare it across groups and they say no difference. But that's actually a very rough way to analyze data. And there you can get much more precise information. Now, if you look at performance on these tasks, I told you earlier that if you take a strictly inhibition approach, The expectation would be that if bilinguals have better inhibition, we would expect them to do better on incongruent trials, but we wouldn't expect any difference on congruent trials because there's no particular problem there. Although the study I just passed over quickly shows it's more complex than that. Just trust me on this one. So if you really look at it then, these tasks, these trials require more than just inhibition. They also require attention to monitor trial-to-trial changes and to evaluate what's going on each trial, whether or not inhibition is involved. So if we could separate how much of the performance measure is reflecting inhibition and how much is reflecting this attention, that might be another way in to see what's really going on with monolinguals and bilinguals in these simple tasks. And there actually is a way of doing it, and it's using Gaussian analyses. So Gaussian analysis has two parts. The X stands for exponential. The exponential part of the RT curve is driven by different processes than the Gaussian part, which is the mean distribution. And Gaussian analyses separate these two components of the response time distribution. So instead of just taking the overall mean, an Gaussian analysis will examine the exponential part and the mean distribution separately. And the argument is, and believe me, I'm no expert, so I'm about to tell you pretty much everything I know about these analyses, so don't ask me anymore. But inhibition, the inhibition component, is reflected, this is the Gaussian part, is reflected as mu, which is the overall mean, and it's larger for incongruent trials, as it should be. On average, they take longer. But attention is reflected in the exponential component, and it's signified as tau, and it is smaller when attention is better. So if you can maintain attention, do the monitoring shifting, the tau component is smaller, and those two components move independently. So whatever's happening for the overall reaction time, you can still extract what's happening for attention. There are now half a dozen studies that I know of, maybe there's more now, that have used Gaussian analyses to examine these data, and I'm just going to tell you about one. This is Xiao and his colleagues. They've done a few of these. So they looked at data from monolinguals and bilinguals doing these standard executive function tasks. And crucially, if you just go ahead and report the ANOVAs, like most people do, there's no group difference. That's, well known, okay? Here are the data. Now, and because these aren't my graphs, I don't have monolinguals in red. I just have what they have in the paper. So monolinguals are filled bars, bilinguals are unfilled bars, and this is the flanker task, Stroop task, and assignment task. These are mu figures, which is like the mean RT, and in every case, for both congruent and incongruent trials, there are absolutely no group differences. And that's where most studies end. If you look at the analysis of tau, now remember, smaller tau means better attention. And here are the three tasks: flanker, Stroop, and Simon. And in every case, the bilinguals are showing better attention. So what is this controversy all about? What's going on with all of this research? There are many positive effects of bilingualism, People report them every day. I get papers every day. But the pattern is inconsistent, and this leads to this tremendous reaction in which there's a desire to say that because the pattern is inconsistent or we can't see the pattern, none of this is valid. So how do you choose whether you're going to accept the positive results that are produced all the time or the null results that are also produced all the time? And I have to interject at this point, you notice what's missing. There is no body of research showing bilinguals are worse than monolinguals on any of these tasks. That doesn't happen. So the question isn't, whether bilingualism is bad for people, but rather whether we can find a measurable benefit from bilingualism. So let's look first at why one might argue the best, the most logical, the most efficacious decision is to reject the positive results. Now, I've listed 3 here, but I'm only going to show you evidence for one of them in the interest of time. There's evidence for all of them. So the first one is that you shouldn't believe these data because the designs have confounded bilingualism with other factors. The one that's cited most often is socioeconomic status. So it's not about bilingualism, it's about socioeconomic status. Let's look at the evidence. So we know that SES is a hugely important predictor of executive function development in children. In fact, I would say it's the #1 predictor. Nothing is more important than SES in determining children's development of executive functioning. So here's a study that was conducted from an online database of children in the US. 18,000 children that varied hugely in SES from extremely low to extremely high. If you have 18,000 kids, you can get a full continuum. And they were given a variety of executive functioning tests which were collapsed into a single score. I don't remember how that happened, but again, these are online databases. They're publicly accessible. And so Hartanto and her group, they're actually in Singapore, accessed these data and conducted these analyses. So here we have the executive function scores for this very large group of children as a function of SES. Look first at the monolinguals. I said a few minutes ago that SES is the largest predictor of executive functioning. So you would expect higher SES to be associated with higher executive function scores. That's exactly what you get. Okay, as SES goes up, so does the EC score. But look at the bilinguals. 2 things. One is that line is always higher. Wherever you are on the SES scale, the bilinguals are doing better. And importantly, I think more than importantly, crucially, the biggest benefit is for those who need it most. Those who are in more impoverished environments that are important for developing SES. Some of that work is done just by being bilingual. So that's the first, and we can see that bilingualism boosted EF across the board, especially in low SES. And a second example is that we also know that low SES is associated with lower cortical volume in children, which is really important. The development of these neuronal connections that add to cortical density is depleted in low SES unstimulating environments. So this is a study of 562 children, and we're going to look at cortical volume where SES is just a binary, low versus high, and we have bilingual and monolingual children. start with high SES, there's actually no significant difference. If you look at high SES here in the Hartanto study, that difference is significant, but you can see it's relatively small compared to lower SES. But look at low SES. This is Natalie Brito, her work. In the low SES environments, you get the extremely diminished cortical volume in the monolinguals that has been previously reported in the literature, and you get an enormous mitigation effect in bilinguals. So SES, well, sure, SES matters, but it isn't a confound. It isn't explaining the results we find for bilingualism. So in terms of SES, this has been amply investigated. I just showed you 2 studies. There are many more. Others have argued publication bias is why it looks like bilinguals outperform monolinguals. I think this is a very silly argument. Of course there's publication bias. Journals prefer to publish studies that show a difference rather than studies that show nothing, no effect. So that's true. But what the publication bias effect does is affect possibly the ratio of positive to negative results. It does not invalidate the reliability or the validity of the positive results. So I think it's a very misleading argument. And finally, there's an argument that any study with a large N shows no difference between groups. That's the argument. I've just shown you 2 large N studies that do show a difference between 2 groups. So those are the reasons people have suggested for rejecting positive results. So let's look now at reasons to reject null results. Why should we believe the positive results? And the first one, and this is the only one I'm going to show you data on, is definition of bilingualism. This is big. What do we mean anyway by bilingual? And researchers are now just beginning to come to terms with this as a problem. So bilingualism is a position on a continuum. It is not a categorical feature. It is something that varies massively across individuals with experience. And what we now know is that the degree and type of bilingualism determines the outcomes. So you can't just pour people into 2 vats and label them monolingual or bilingual. It depends on what you mean. So very quickly, here is a regression line showing this is performance on a flanker task. This is degree of bilingualism. The more bilingual these people were, the smaller the congruency effect, the better they did overall on the task. This is a study that was published last year using, I think, a flanker task as well. The more experience months being immersed in a bilingual environment. This is actually brain data. We have parallel data from this study on performance data. The more bilingual, the bigger the effect. And I think I have one more. This is children doing, again, a flanker task. The more bilingual they are, the better they did. The point of all those studies is that there is a continuous relationship. Here's another way of looking at it. This study was actually done in 2006-07 by my star graduate student, Gigi Luck, who to this day has not published it. So against Gigi's wishes, I'm going to tell you about the data because I think they're amazing. So she took 140 young adults and she divided them into degree of bilingualism and gave them a bunch of non-conflict tasks and conflict tasks. So these are high proficiency bilinguals, low proficiency bilinguals. These are unbalanced. I don't even remember what these categories are. And the reds are monolingual. So these are shades of bilingual, with the dark blue being the most bilingual, and these are monolingual. So on a non-conflict task, everybody performs the same. If there's a conflict task, there is a significant difference between the monolinguals and the most bilingual. But if you look at these intermediate contrasts, none of them is significant. So if all of these people are then averaged into one lump sum, there may or may not be a language group difference. It only emerges when you examine, in this case, their proficiency and use. So you had those two separate things. And the last but not least example of the same point is from your very own Ramesh Mishra, who's done several of these studies comparing high and low proficiency Hindi speakers. And here the red bars are the high proficiency, the green bars are the low proficiency. Everybody is bilingual. We're looking in a more fine-tuned way at what do we mean by bilingual, how bilingual, what kind of bilingual. And again, without taking the time to go through all of this, you can see that in every analysis, the pattern is absolutely clear. It depends on how bilingual you are. And there aren't even monolinguals in this study. So that's the first point. Definition of bilinguals. If you don't say what you mean by bilingual and report how bilingual they are, you can't really interpret the results. And the other 2 points are the type of task. I'm not going to go through this, but there are multiple examples. You have the same groups of people. Tasks that vary in their demands for attention will lead to different results. Context is now emerging as something hugely important. And here I point you to the really excellent ideas presented in the adaptive control model by Green and Abudulabi. All right. So what does this all mean? Let's move. Why does this matter? So executive functioning, I said many times, is really important. And increasingly, we're thinking about it not just in terms of whether or not you can do a Stroop task faster, who cares really, but increasingly we're thinking about it in terms of mental resilience. And if you use terms like that, then what's immediately relevant is that other end of the lifespan where there is normal, healthy, actual cognitive decline in older age, and potentially accompanied by non-healthy cognitive decline, including dementia and Alzheimer's disease. This is important for lots of reasons, not the least of which is there are no effective interventions for Alzheimer's disease. There simply are not. So if there is some kind of a lifestyle approach, that would be big. Now, the approach under lifestyle is cognitive reserve. This is the idea that the natural decline of brain in blue and cognitive in green function with age over time can be dissociated so that despite this decline in brain structure, the cognitive level remains higher. That is cognitive reserve, and our argument is that bilingualism contributes to that very important dissociation. Now, if we give older adults who are monolingual and bilingual these simple cognitive tasks, sometimes they do better, sometimes they don't. It's complex. But when you look at their brains, you see differences all the time. And increasingly what we're seeing is that if you look in the brains of healthy older adults, people who report no memory problems, no impairments, and they perform these tasks to the same level, you look in their brains and the bilinguals, in fact, are dealing with more deterioration. So let's see how this shows up. The first study we published in 2007 took the very simple idea that if bilinguals' brains were declining, but their cognitive level wasn't, then it should take longer for clinical symptoms of dementia to appear. And we found that in 2007 and reported it. And since then, these are other studies that have found the same thing. And I have to point out the very excellent data from Hyderabad. Right there, they might be on this chart more than once. This isn't even all of the studies. These are mean age of diagnosis. And so now a higher blue bar means they're older. And even when there isn't a little star over it, the bilinguals are still older. And there's all sorts of statistical reasons why the difference may or may not be significant. So whatever's going on, bilinguals are being diagnosed at an older age. Well, maybe they're just not showing up. Maybe they're just so much more impaired by the time they get to the clinic. We know that's not true because of studies like this. And again, I'm just going to give you a snapshot. In the two studies I'm about to show you, Alzheimer's patients show up in the clinic and they show absolutely equivalent clinical levels of functioning. They look exactly the same and they receive a diagnosis either of MCI in the first study, mild cognitive impairment, or Alzheimer's disease. Now, one of the markers of impairment is how the brain metabolizes glucose. And as the glucose metabolism begins to crumble, we get cognitive impairment. So there should be a correlation between glucose metabolism and cognitive level. That's the assumption because it's well known in healthy populations. So compare monolinguals and bilinguals, two studies. The first one is a rather small study, and the bilinguals have significantly poorer glucose uptake for exactly the same cognitive level. And in the second study, a larger group, independently conducted, bilinguals also had greater impairment in glucose uptake. Their brains are worse. They have more disease. They are struggling with more neuropathology. And yet, the cognitive level is the same. And that's the reason they show up later at the clinic and are older when they are diagnosed. Because despite the pathology, their cognitive level is preserved. And the final study I want to tell you about is really, I find, quite remarkable. I give a lot of talks and people would ask me, so if that's true, so countries that are more bilingual should have less Alzheimer's disease, right? And I'd say, yeah, but you can't possibly test that. I mean, how are you going to compare countries? Everything is different. So that's what I would say until somebody did it. And what this group did, this is Ray Klein and his group, compared the rate of Alzheimer's disease in 95 countries, linguistically classified for the overall bilingualism of the population. So countries were classified by the mean number of languages spoken per person in that population. Now, as I said, everything is different. How do you compare countries? Well, one of the big things is this. Alzheimer's disease is a disease of aging, which means you have to live long enough to get it. So the life expectancy of the country is really important. So countries with a higher life expectancy overall should have more Alzheimer's disease, regardless of whether or not there's an additional effect of bilingualism. They also controlled for healthcare, income, all sorts of quality of life vectors that impact on incidence of Alzheimer's disease. And here's what they found. I'm going to put the graph up. It's a very messy graph. Again, it's taken right from their paper, so it needs explanation. This is all their data, and as I say, it looks messy. So this is the mean number of languages spoken according to their analysis. And this is the incidence of Alzheimer's disease per 100,000 population. So higher numbers on the y-x-axis are therefore countries with greater incidence of Alzheimer's disease. Now this is messy. Oh, also there's 3 lines, countries with low, medium, or high life expectancy. Now the simplest way to clean up this graph is to point out that 90% of the data include countries with 1 or 2 languages, and the rest of these data points are kind of noise because there aren't enough to continue this as a linear trend. So just look at countries that are essentially monolingual versus bilingual, because there's enough data to see patterns. Start with countries with low life expectancy. And what you see very clearly is a very low and flat line. There's not a lot of Alzheimer's disease, and it doesn't matter how many languages they speak. You've got to live long enough to get Alzheimer's disease. So that black line marks a kind of a base. Medium life expectancy, just within this frame, comparing monolingual to bilingual countries, that's a significant difference where the monolingual countries have a higher incidence than the bilingual countries. But the real payoff comes in countries where people live a long time, long enough to get Alzheimer's disease. And now you see the high in monolingual countries compared to bilingual countries. And that's a huge and significant difference. So there is a lower incidence of Alzheimer's disease in countries that are more bilingual. Now, if you'll indulge me, I wanted to talk a little bit about the mechanism. Do I have about 3 more minutes, if that's okay? Okay. This is where we started. This is the Miyake model with its logic based on the notion that these subcomponents of executive functioning have some integrity, and therefore this line of logic ensues. The mechanism underlying this logic, the reason it happens is transfer. So if bilinguals have better inhibition, that better inhibition transfers to everything where inhibition is required. But I don't think inhibition is the right mechanism. So here's how inhibition works. You develop a skill in one context and apply it to another context. So in the experience of inhibiting a language is applied to a non-linguistic context, like inhibiting the position of the stimulus in the Simon task. So it's a transfer effect. That's why bilinguals do better on the Simon task. They've transferred something they learned in a different context. But adaptation is different. In adaptation, you have 2 skills that rely to various extents on an underlying process. And then if that process, call it selective attention, is modified, then everything that it's used for may or may not be affected, but to different degrees. So if selective attention develops in a context of bilingual experience, then that ability is differentially available for everything to which it may be required. So it's the underlying adaptation in a fundamental process that manifests across several domains and not necessarily equivalently. And that's what I think we mean by neuroplasticity, that there's an experience that leads to adaptation of a process that shows up in new functions. So here's that map again of all the studies. If you want to talk about transfer being the mechanism, then you could probably talk about transfer for young adults doing this Droop task. But you can't talk about, I can't imagine how transfer in any way explains the evidence I've shown you from infants or older adults, or the massive amount of brain data that I haven't talked about at all. That's not transfer. So I would argue that's adaptation. And specifically, it's adaptation of attention networks. So does bilingualism affect cognitive and brain structures? Well, it does. But to understand those changes, I've been arguing that the standard componential model is not very helpful. In other words, we've been looking in the wrong place. My conclusion is that bilingual experience reconfigures the fundamental attention networks in the brain, and that bilingualism is therefore a relevant source of neuroplasticity that leads to an adaptation and eventually contributes to cognitive reserve. So there is the set of neuroplastic experiences that have been studied, and I submit we can add bilingualism to the list. And there's my lab on Zoom and my funding agencies, and I thank you very much.
Well, all right. So I think it was a pretty well-rounded, incisive talk, and then went on to pass some really critical judgments, and I think not many people would be influenced, particularly the concerns she expressed with regard to Miyake's model. And I see every other day papers, drawing their inspiration from the model and then going to the data. And the other very important point with which I have been, I have been working on that idea, the adaptation, the essence of adapting in a complex environment that keeps changing dynamically, irrespective of the country, for different sets of people. So bilingualism is one aspect of that adaptation. I don't want to really get into a lot of academic questions. She already has exhausted herself, but I want to ask something. What set you on the path of exploring bilingualism? Was it I know it. You have to go back to a bit of your own biography, but
yeah. Well, okay. So I'll give the critical. I mean, you fall into things. Stuff happens, and you just say, "Okay, I'll do that." Right. So there was never a conscious decision. I was interested in children's development of language and thought, but I can tell you how I came to think that whatever was happening with bilingualism was not just a linguistic issue, it was a cognitive issue. So that is a question I really can answer. So I was looking at children's development of language, and then at the time, this is the 1970s, metalinguistic development was a big issue. And there were some studies showing bilingual children had better metalinguistic performance than monolingual children. Made sense. They spoke two languages. Why shouldn't they have better concepts? It was just all sort of boring and ordinary. And I was doing that boring and ordinary work, showing metalinguistic development in general, but then particularly if it's different for bilingual children, thinking knowing more languages just enhances their awareness of language. Until I kept getting this finding. So one of the ways of studying metalinguistic analysis, I suppose still, I don't know, is asking people, not just children, but anybody, to make judgments about the grammaticality of a sentence. Because the idea is if you can evaluate grammatical form, you have some sense of what qualifies as metalinguistic. So we gave kids sentences to judge, things like apples grow on trees. Is that said the right way? Yeah, right, okay. But we mixed it up a bit because at one point we added another dimension. We said, all right, tell me if a sentence is said the right way. It doesn't matter if a sentence is silly, just tell me if it's said the right way, okay? Apples grow on trees. Yeah, that's said the right way. And we have monolingual and bilingual kids doing this. And then we say, okay, apples grow on noses. Is it said the right way? And the kids all keel over, laughing from the silly image. But only the bilingual kids can say, but it's said the right way. And the monolingual kids say, no, you can't say that. So that was the finding, sort of the basic piece of data that made me realize this wasn't about language. This was about something else. And so that started, this is really going back to the late 70s. It started a series of investigations that really didn't get published until the 80s, where I tried to understand what was different for the bilingual kids.
Okay. Now, coming in, to another very critical point, the research on bilingualism, I think, happens on three triads. One is what we know about the brain as of now, given all the developments in neuroimaging. What we know of the cognitive systems from cognitive psychology, which has come all the way since 60s at least. Particularly, the focus is on attention, and theorization on attention keeps changing all the time, including components of attention. Even there, people don't agree, disagree all the time. And third is the ever-changing socio-cultural setup of the world that we live in, from country to country, from provinces to provinces. So as a bilingualism researcher, particularly in cognitive science, one has to keep track of all these three things together, which, of course we cannot, but we should when interpreting it as the result. So what's your take on this? How does that work for you?
I think you're right. I think that this is a really important feature. And I also think that that's one of the reasons that when you pigeonhole this stuff and say, let's just look at the reaction time differences for these, first-year psychology students doing the flanker task, why you then inevitably miss the point. Because it is all of these things. There's stuff going on in the brain. There's other more sensitive ways to examine the cognition, and crucially, it's all happening in a socio-political context. And I think the socio-political context is enormous. And I think there's an almost desperation from some people in some socio-political contexts who not want this to be true. So I agree with you entirely and would raise the stakes and say, not only can we not track all of this as any one individual, but because it sits on all of those foundations, that's also why this research is so misunderstood. It's become too simplified. You take these big complex questions and you shrink it down to some simplistic binary idea, you're going to miss the forest.
Yeah, Ellen, we have, because it is science and science's wheels are all the time to homogenize and level things up, but then we are working in a humanistic, language after all is for people to express culture and all kinds of things come in. So that fine balance often gets very difficult, at least when we are, either we become very quantitative or at times we become a little, allowing a little bit of that. But nonetheless, something, you commented on and you have written on it on the replication issues. there are two ways to replicate. One is to directly, exactly, which is rather impossible. Suddenly you come down to India and do it. You don't, know under the circumstances in which I collected data, or if I come down to Canada or elsewhere. So direct replications are rare. All the controversies, all the claims that that are of this type, that there is no advantage, are of conceptual replication. And many times I find problems or issues in the replication. So should the null results of replicated studies be further replicated in order to verify that, okay, uh, these are sacrosanct facts on which now we should all agree. Um,
Well, it's an important point because I'm asked all the time, if you're so worried about replication, if you're so sure that your results are right, then why don't you do either one of these, registration things where different labs sign up to promise to follow the same recipe, or do one of these many labs things that are becoming popular, everybody does their piece. Well, it's because of what you just said. Because you can't, if I send you my sort of recipe for a study we're doing, and you do it with your participants in Hyderabad, you may or may not get the same results, but it has nothing to do with the essential question. So again, I agree with you that the simple solutions are wrong precisely because they don't acknowledge all of these interacting dimensions of bilingual experience.
and my last question, then I would leave it open. As we know, the world has changed because of COVID, and we, as language users, have come down to adapt to a different mode altogether. And people are not, and there are many other issues that I don't want to get into, masks on, and how do you get the cues? Because we always developed our theories based on what language to speak to with the whole face. So how do you see if this continues? Which there are many commentators, at least in periodicals, telling that okay, a lot of things would remain so even if we develop a vaccine. How do you see the research in our area or related areas changing with regard to the human experience? Because that's kind of
because COVID is changing. I'm gonna ask. I'm not answer your question directly. I'm gonna go a little bit beside your question.
Yeah. Do you think the social distancing, the use of masks, and people not being face to face talking will change quite significantly the practice of bilingualism, and therefore the cognitive and other consequences?
I think everything is up for grabs. I have a colleague of mine in the psychology department who just published a study, got a huge amount of attention. It was covered in the New York Times and stuff. He studies things like face perception. So he did an online study where he showed people faces, they had to learn them, and then he put masks on these faces to see people, these participants could recognize the faces they just learned. And, the results are sort of predictable, but data are data. A huge drop. So the way we interact, I think, is on the line. The way we use language is on the line. Is it going to change the desire to be bilingual? Well, I don't know if our whole possibility for travel and social interaction and community integration is compromised, maybe. I think it's impossible to know, but I think everything is on the line. I think COVID is changing the world as we know it.
Okay, now I request any audience who may have questions, kindly be specific and direct, and Helen would be happy to answer. And we have some time. Yeah. Please tell your name, what you do, and so that it tells us the context. Yeah.
So, good day. I am Suvarna Ladi, Professor Ellen Bialystok. It was lovely listening to you.
So nice to see you.
Oh, yes. It's lovely to have you with the Hyderabad audience. Really lovely. So,
you are forgetting that.
and actually, I am in Hyderabad now. I'm visiting family here. And my group from Bangalore has all just joined. So, it's been wonderful. And I must tell your students, Ramesh, who are here, that we actually did replicate Professor Ellen Bialystok's work almost to the T. And I remember that in 2010, we had about 247 patients and we found the same result, and we waited for another 4 years So we went up to 640 patients, we found the same results, and I wrote to her before it was published. So I think, yes, we were able to replicate it in a completely different society. So that was, and then she's been inspirational. And yes, my question really is, how do we link all the work that you've done in cognitive psychology about executive function, executive control, to a protection against dementia? And I'm really, really happy to listen to your talk today, to understand that it's about neuroplasticity, is about adaptation. So if we were really to study the cognitive processes that underlie adaptation, what would we be doing? And the reason I ask is because, again, cognitive reserve has become a very fashionable word now. Everybody is talking about cognitive reserve like it's a binary. And and education is the one factor that's been, a very strong indicator of cognitive reserve. But then it's even more complex than bilingualism. I think the advantage of bilingualism is, because of the criticism, the research has been of extremely high quality, because every time you question again and again, so the best kind of people are working in the field. And I would like to know from Professor Bialystok, since you're thinking about neuroplasticity, is it specific? Do you think each experience has a specific effect on cognitive processes and a different effect? And, neuroplasticity is an umbrella term. Or do you think that they will kind of converge? I know we don't know the answers, but you've thought so much about it. So I would like to know from you what you think about
Well, Varna, thank you. That is a whole pile of questions. And not surprisingly, it really gets to the heart of all of this. So obviously, let me say right up front, I don't have an answer, but I have some random bullets I can throw at it. First, do all of these experiences create cognitive reserve in the same way? I would say no.
Okay.
By the way, here's a little aside that gives me great pleasure. People say, well, there's also studies that show bilingualism doesn't create cognitive reserve because we didn't find a difference in our Alzheimer's patients. And so one group who published that, and it's actually because this is the group from New York that published that in neuropsychology, and they said, no, there's no effect of bilingualism. The same group 2 years earlier published a study using the same faulty methodology saying there's no effective education. So we say, all right, if you're going to rule out education, just give up, right? Because obviously you're not doing this the right way. So I agree with you. Education is the one everyone can agree on. So I think that the different experiences have different ways of doing this. I also agree with you that at some ultimate point, it converges. So what is going on? I think what these intense, prolonged experiences do is force the brain into a more efficient use of attentional resources. So I don't think that there's a bigger capacity for attention, but I think that the attention is used more efficiently. Why does that matter? Well, to put it in the most colloquial possible terms, it reduces wear and tear. So our brains are configured with a particular, best buy date, right? The manufacturer's warranty is going to start wearing out, and it gets more effortful, it gets rustier. But these experiences keep the brain more finely tuned. So I'm going to tell you a story that I can't get out of my mind. This is a story that happened more than 60 years ago to me. My father had a small business where he sold auto parts for car repairs. So his customers would be things like garages, or what we call backyard mechanics. I don't know what you call them, but people who do their own car repair. So they'll come into his store and they'll say, I need spark plugs for a 1957 Chevy. And he would say, all right, which engine does it have? And they always said the same thing. They always said, the big one. Okay, well, these are guys, right, trying that their car has the big engine. And I said to my father, we had this conversation more than once because I could never understand it. I said, why is it so important to them to have the big engine? The speed limit on the streets is 30 miles an hour. All the cars can go 30 miles an hour. Why do they have to have the big engine? And he said, because if you have the big engine, you'll go 30 miles an hour, but you'll go smoother, and the engine won't break down as fast, and there will be less wear and tear. So I filed that away over 60 years ago, and now I see things like, well, monolinguals and bilinguals perform the flanker task in 500 milliseconds. Why does it matter if there's something else that's different? And the difference is what my father told me. They go smoother and there's less wear and tear. And we see that payoff in older age. So when we look at the bilingual brain later, it can absorb more, it can sustain more. The sort of expensive and effortful demands on those attention systems is reduced because it just all works better. And it's the constant use of those networks to manage jointly activated languages that keeps it all online. And I just want to say that for me, the most exciting new data we have, not yet published, it was about to be written up, and then COVID shut down the first author because he has kids at home. The most exciting new data we have is showing significant differences in the network, resting state network activity of monolingual and bilingual older adults. And where is the difference? In the frontal parietal control network, the region that's responsible for managing attention. That's where it is. So that's what I think it all leads to, that it practices up, it refines the system where the payoff is later. The payoff isn't being able to do a Stroop task 20 milliseconds faster. Who cares? The payoff is in this adaptation of how the whole brain network works.
Thank you. Lovely.
Yeah, I would just like to add one point there. Since we are talking about bilingualism from the lens of attention and adaptation, I think that the primary drive of life is to find out what works best for you and what you want. So attention has been held as the single most, since James and many other people, as the single most drive that really narrows down your focus and you. But when it comes to language selection, with regard to again another context or another country or another set of people, you make a decisive choice whether you want to be multilingual when you arrive in a culturally diverse, or you arrive in a monolingual country, or you would prefer another mode of life. There was a recent documentary, I believe there are papers as well, Turkish immigrants who have been in Germany, and as you may know that it has been a very widely publicized. There are many documentaries. So this study tracked people for the last 5 years of these people, and they found out that those of them who did not have any German or any English language, who did very well in life later, adapted to the language pretty fast, and they also showed less of Turkish language use in public space. So they kind of geared towards being more adapting to the culture. And many of them they could not, and they lived in smaller other places in and around Berlin or Hamburg. So there is a the understanding is that the way one wants to adapt is not a homogeneous thing. One makes a conscious decision, and if it works, then it works. So I think of the question of attention's involvement in bilingualism also is related to the societal context in which this particular individual. Because most of us, we Indians, we grow up, we don't think about bilingualism, multilingualism in any particular way. I mean, I was asked by people, what are you studying? It's everywhere. Well, still I don't know how to answer that question. It's everywhere. So,
well, I think that's right, and that's why I just made reference to this really important work that Green and Abudalebi did by laying out some of the social and contextual differences in how language is used or expected, and they all matter. Where I would disagree with you, I think most people who become bilingual do not do it by choice. They don't decide to live in a bilingual country or learn another language for some, reason. I think most people are bilingual because their life has required it. So it's not a choice. And parents say to me, well, I see your work, so I want my newborn child to have great executive function. Should I teach them another language? And I always say, by all means, teach them another language, but not because you want them to have great executive function. You teach them another language because it's important to know other languages. So I don't think that this research then sets a purpose for bilingualism. I think it explains a consequence that, the language stands on its own. And this is particularly the case because sometimes the parents who ask me this question, and I find this to be very heartbreaking, the parents who ask me this question speak some other heritage language, and they want to know if they should teach it to their children. And I say, are you kidding me? It's your language. That's what this child's grandparents speak. Of course you have to teach your child that language. So, I take your point and say we really have to move away from thinking of this as a reason to learn another language and just understand languages matter greatly and they have this set of consequences.
All right, other questions from the audience?
I have a question, and this is with regard to the language use and experience. So, bilinguals are of different types, and even the kind of languages that they acquire or learn sometimes belong to the same linguistic family, sometimes they don't. For an example, if you look at Norwegian and English, they have similar grammar structure. Or if you look at Spanish and English, they have similar phonetic structure. It's easy when compared to a bilingual who has very different grammar and phonetic structure. For an example, English and Telugu. So do you think their executive functions would be affected by these factors? Because this also accounts to the linguistic experience, and probably they need, like for an example, Telugu English bilinguals, they need more inhibitory control, or else they need more any other executive functions when compared to the ones that are similar. This is what I wanted to know.
So there isn't really conclusive evidence. So let me make a distinction between the effect of the language relation, the language families, on learning another language, where there is clearly a large effect. You can learn another language that has a family resemblance more easily than one of these other languages, versus the cognitive effects once you've learned those languages. And I've seen no reason. There's some people who argue there are differences. There isn't a lot of data. And for example, Jubin Abudalebi argues that you get bigger cognitive effects from, I don't even remember if he says from related versus unrelated languages, because in the rest of the research that's looked at that, I don't see that you can make those claims. Suvarna might know, because in their very large patient sample, there were many different kinds of languages, and maybe that would be a way of looking at it for that particular question, because your sample was so big.
So
Also, I don't think it matters, because if you are a bilingual, you are not focusing on the structures of both the languages, however different they could be. When you are using both the languages, I don't think your attentional focus is on the structural differences of the languages, because you have acquired them in a way so as to use them as your weapons. So this issue of trying to separate out both languages based on the linguistic differences There are those some studies, maybe from Oxford or Cambridge, I'm forgetting. There are some studies that find dialectal differences. People with dialectal differences, I mean, within two dialects also, there is a cognitive advantage difference.
Well, right. But Ramesh, the argument is that if the languages are more similar, there's more conflict. And so it requires more effort. That's the way the argument goes. But I don't know any evidence. But I'd be curious, Savannah, do you have any evidence?
Yeah, so the reviewers of one of our papers asked us this question. So we did look at language combinations, and this frequently comes up in most of the work that we do. We're always asked this question. And every time we've looked at language combinations, we have so far not found a difference. Now, having said that, this journey has taught us another thing. So when a language from, say, an Indo-Aryan family is spoken in Hyderabad, which is a very Dravidian region. So you have Telugu, which is a Dravidian language, and you have Urdu, which is an Indo-Aryan or Indo-Persian language. Over centuries or years, the Urdu spoken grammatically starts taking the form of the local language. So the Urdu that's spoken, even though it's a different language family to begin with, take some of the characteristics of the local language. So the language distance has to be, you have to factor that in as well. So the Urdu spoken in Hyderabad will be very different from the Urdu spoken in Delhi. So it's a very but we didn't find any differences. But then again, these are just patients with dementia. We haven't done experimental work on these people. So maybe Ramesh, you could take up this question.
I would like to share one study that I did on older people, not patients, running a battery of tasks, and it was published in, I forgot the journal, last year. And that was apparently, my question was whether, aging normal people in Hyderabad, because of their second language background or use, do they show any cognitive advantage? And I find none. I found none. So I was, my question was, if they go into a clinic tomorrow and you start taking their data, and most of the time we have people, their family members, giving you any sort of data. So I am still thinking on that line. Maybe a large-scale study is necessary, because we have to first establish a norm who has been a bilingual of what sort, and what happens. Quickly, everything changes. He has a stroke or he is diagnosed, because that transition is to be accounted for with a definite understanding of the past. And I mean, I have not done it. My study was experimental, and it's published already. I can send a copy to both of you. And that should be actually studies of this nature. And your study, I must say, was one of the first to break in a big way with the literacy angle, which is central for our country, still remains so. And I think many of these ideas, many students are listening. They would like to pick up. Here are some people I know they're interested in pursuing. So the world is open. Yeah. Any other questions? We are running.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Seema. I'm a final year PhD student with Professor Mishra at University of Hyderabad. So if the idea is that bilingual experience leads to adaptation of attentional networks, does that in any way mean that attention is somehow more susceptible to neuroplasticity than other cognitive systems like inhibition or monitoring, let's say? Is the idea that there's something special, which is why we're seeing better bilingual performance on those tasks?
No, I think that's an excellent question. And what I think about it is that these systems, attention versus inhibition and monitoring, exist at different levels. So in the Miyake model, he focused in at this much more specific level, inhibition, right? Or shifting, updating. We're saying that attention stands above all of that. So what does inhibition mean? Inhibition means don't pay attention to this. Now, if you don't pay attention to this, it means you do pay attention to that. You can't talk about inhibition without talking about attention to something else. And what we know from language is that when we say you're inhibiting the non-target language, you're not really doing that at all. You never inhibit it. That other language never goes away. What you're doing is paying more attention to that. So even what we call inhibition is really just a calibration of attention. And I would say that you can do that same kind of mental exercise for all of the components that stand at that intermediate level, like working memory and shifting. They all are aspects of attention. And so if you want to understand the big picture, you've got to understand what's most fundamental. And I'm arguing that it's attention. Inhibition is, I would call it epiphenomenal. That is to say, it doesn't really exist. It isn't a thing. Inhibition isn't really a thing. You don't ever actually inhibit anything in these tasks. These are all manifestations of managing attention to some goal.
And we know from attention research, particularly in visual search, that anything that you have considered as a distractor, you have ignored, actually comes to hunt you down very soon after, more strongly ever. So it's changing. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Hi, my name is Vasundhara and I'm a research scholar in Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. And it was great listening to you, Professor Bialystok. So my question is bit of related to specific language impairment and bilingualism. So research says that disentangling bilingualism and specific language impairment is a bit of difficult. So probably I want to know your take on what do you think that, like, would you recommend bilingualism for specific language children suffering from specific language impairment, and specifically when they belong to an ethnic minority? So because a lot of globalization and industrialization is happening, and that is making more immigrants in different parts of the world. So they have to take their heritage language when they are in home, and when they are exposed, so children, when they are exposed to school, their heritage language becomes a minority language. And disentangling specific language impairment and bilingualism becomes difficult. So would you recommend bilingualism in that case?
Okay, it's an important question. Thank you for asking it. Now, this isn't the research I do, so I'm going to defer to a friend and colleague of mine who does this research, and I think does it better than anyone, and that's Catherine Conert. Now, she has the unique qualification of being both an excellent psychological researcher and a certified speech-language pathologist. And so she deals with these issues all the time. And in her book, which I think is now in the 3rd edition, which is something like Language Impairment in Bilingual Populations or something, she talks about all this, but it all comes down to the following little thought experiment or riddle. What do you get when you take a bilingual child with a language impairment and take away one of the languages? What do you get? What you get is a monolingual child with a language impairment. You haven't changed anything, except you've reduced the number of languages this child has access to. And that little sort of aphoristic anecdote, I think, sums up what we have to think about. So obviously, if you compare bilingual children with specific language impairments, or indeed with any kind of learning disability, to bilingual children without such impairments, they're not going to do as well. But that's the wrong comparison. You have to compare them to monolingual children with the same impairments to see if they manage to hold on anyway while still maintaining another language. So it's all about, and the problem is, as you probably know since you asked the question, the clinical assessment materials for these conditions, these diagnoses, are all normed on monolinguals. And you have no idea what they're picking up. when they're applied to bilingual populations. So it's extremely complex, very important, but I would argue the right answer, as much as possible, is you keep all the languages and address the specific language impairment on its own.
All right, I think it's time to any one last if.
I have a question regarding you have shown that as we age, our brain structures deteriorate, but bilinguals are able to sustain their cognitive abilities. So, isn't this a good empirical evidence against eliminative materialism? Because it's showing that our cognitive abilities are very clearly different from what our brain structures are. So, has this successfully contributed there?
Well, possibly. I mean, I don't have an answer exactly. But, I think that, well, maybe I'm not clear what the question part of it is. What is it that you want me to comment on?
The dissociation between cognitive abilities and the brain structure, especially in Alzheimer's disease, it's shown empirically that cognitive abilities sustain despite the deteriorating brain structures.
Yeah.
So we see the difference between these two things very clearly.
Yeah.
Yet when we read about the question about how the mind and the brain are different, we read that there's not a lot of empirical progress. So I think this particular study, particular group of studies about Alzheimer's contribute to this.
Okay, that support the idea. It could be. I have to say I don't know those studies, so just from your description, it seems consistent. I would say, but I really can't comment because I don't know this. I don't know the research.
I think what she's trying to cast a net from philosophy of mind, eliminative materialism. Is this idea that biology is essentially all that is there, and psychology is not that But then let me tell you that working cognitive psychologists hardly pay any attention to debates in philosophy of mind.
Okay. So that's why I have no idea what she's talking about here. Thank you for that.
On the other hand, although it's an important question, on the other hand, philosophers of mind who are interested hardly read cognitive psychology. I mean, maybe two in the world, maybe Ned Block, maybe one other. But the church lands, I'm not quite sure from where you are drawing your maybe big. So to round it off, it's a very it's what we do and we know about bilingualism, mind brain, and its implications for debates in philosophy of mind would be really far too fast as of now, because it would be, I mean, it's not unattainable, but it would be like going for a real long journey and taking many other things together. So that's my take at this point in time. I mean, whether it is the evidence that they would take or would disagree, I'm not sure, because I have not come across studies being cited in those discussions pertaining to language, but a lot of attention, a lot of awareness, a lot of consciousness comes in there every day. So we have to be a bit.
Thank you. I want to thank you for explaining. I really couldn't see the context. A question has come in through chat from someone who says the bandwidth is low, but I want to answer the question. I'm going to read it. Can bilingualism alone be used as a tool to enhance cognitive abilities in kids under the age of 10 in spite of their low SES and low everyday nutrition? I want to answer that question because we have one study that I think addresses it, although it's a small study. I would not want to overinterpret this study, but it's an interesting study. We went into a very low SES community in Central California, where the kids were the children largely of Mexican migrant agricultural workers. All the kids spoke Spanish and English to varying degrees. All of the kids were poor. All of the kids were doing poorly in school. And we gave them some of our cognitive tasks. So what we're looking at is, despite their overall poor environment, does being more bilingual, which we measured as the ratio of their English and Spanish scores, affect their performance on these executive function tasks. So these were tasks that we use in our research all the time with kids of this age. These kids are about 8 years old, and we know exactly how our kids perform on them. So the first thing to say is all of these kids performed more poorly. They were slower, they made more mistakes. They were all more poorly performing than the kids we usually find with these tasks. However, the more bilingual they were, the better they did. So even in this context, just being a more balanced Spanish-English bilingual was very specifically helping their performance on these tasks after we controlled for everything else. So I would say there's promising but not conclusive evidence that the answer indeed is yes.
All right, I must end it, and I think we have exhausted. And thank you, Ellen, for really taking a very long time and being very present. And I'm happy because this program is now connecting people with similar interests. That I can see many graduate students or would-be graduate students, they now know one another and they can continue the debate. And please shoot emails to her if she would, like to reply, engage more with you. And there are never-ending questions. A fascinating topic, and it has kept itself being interested for so many people. And please watch out this program. Tell your friends. We keep inviting such distinguished people who have influenced fields and ideas. And watch out for our advertisements on the website. I think it was very, very nice and exciting to have a review in these times when it's all foggy out there. It's to be in touch is very important, and we really had an excellent opportunity, and all of us should be very thankful to Ellen for taking the time.
Thank you.
So I thank everybody, particularly the students who have been managing this behind the scene, because it's important to record it. So we put it on YouTube, and you would have again to relook it and pursue the questions. And thank you, Subarna, for joining and your excellent comments. And I hope that we get out of the situation soon, or maybe slowly but decisively. And thank you. So.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it. All the best.
Thank you. Bye, Professor.
Bye.